What happened to Black Clover's art style? The art in Black Clover is one of the series' best qualities, because while haters love to trash talk this manga, nobody can deny the beauty of its backgrounds, fight scenes, and character designs. But that isn't to say that Black Clover has always looked the way it does now. I went back and analyzed the art throughout the entire series, and what I discovered honestly surprised me. So in this video, I'd like to share what I consider to be the 3 stages of Black Clover's artistic evolution, and explain how the series has come to look and feel the way it does today. As I did with the video on Jujutsu Kaisen, this video is solely focused on the manga, meaning I will not be discussing anything regarding the anime. And if I haven't made it abundantly clear by now, this video will contain spoilers. Now, like I said, there are 3 stages in the evolution of Black Clover's art style. You could maybe argue that there's at least 4, but when I really took a close look at the manga, I had a paradigm shift. I went into this thing thinking in my head, well, this is gonna be easy. New Black Clover looks so different and Black Clover changed so much. And then I went back and compared early Black Clover to the new stuff, and I was wrong. So very, very wrong. And you're gonna agree with me when you see how long these stages are and how subtle these changes are. So with that context in mind, let's go ahead and start with Stage 1. Stage 1 starts with Chapter 1 and ends right around Chapter 72. Now, unlike my JJK video, I don't really have any names for these stages because they don't really pertain to specific arcs. The first one I may occasionally refer to as just early Black Clover. Now, while I am going to point out what distinguishes this stage from the following stages, keep in mind that a lot of what pops up now will also be true of the manga 200 chapters later. This is a mix of both early Black Clover qualities as well as defining traits of the art style as a whole. So the first thing I would like to point out, and the first thing anyone will notice, are the detailed backgrounds. And you see this right away in Chapter 1 when you get the introduction and Tabata gives us that panel of the Clover Kingdom, and then on the next page he dedicates the entire page to the giant demon skull. And I just love everything about this panel. There's a sense of time, there's a sense of depth, scale. It's just one of many panels where Tabata shows you a piece of this world and you're like, wow, this is gorgeous. And especially in early Black Clover, this isn't exclusive to big panels like this. This is generally true for any of the backgrounds or scenes that the characters are placed in. Something else I'd like to point out that doesn't get talked about enough is the particular style in which Tabata draws these scenes. Obviously, they're very detailed. And if I asked you, do they look realistic, your gut reaction would be, yeah. But if I asked you to scale that 1 to 10, suddenly it's not as clear. So for example, I mentioned in my other video how backgrounds in Jujutsu Kaisen are realistic, but they feel like CG renderings because they look like they're sort of drawn as is. In Black Clover, Tabata adds a lot of detail, but he also stylizes the scenes. So for example, look at the way he draws clouds. Suddenly you'll notice that while they are very detailed, they look less like real clouds and more like clouds in a fairy tale book. As a matter of fact, a lot of the details in this manga are drawn the same way. 1, because it gives Black Clover a certain tone, and 2, because it serves as a nice contrast to the characters. But before I say more on the characters, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, the characters are also pretty detailed, but not as fully detailed as the backgrounds. So this is where we get into the whole what makes a Black Clover character look like a Black Clover character thing. Tabata follows in the Dragon Ball trend and, as Akira Toriyama said about himself, doesn't try that hard. So the characters have fairly simple designs. In particular, Tabata doesn't add a lot of shading to characters. But at the same time, he draws the characters with just enough detail and adds more in scenes that call for it, especially the more emotional scenes. Also, it's worth noting that Tabata is a master of angles. He draws relatively simple characters, but they never look flat. You always get the sense that this is a 3-dimensional character even without all the shading. This is also partly due to the particular way Tabata draws certain body features. First of all are the hands. Tabata does a great job of drawing realistic hands, but they kinda have a bony look to them, especially up close. They also have pointy noses. Not big, just pointy. The hair has that iconic anime look to it, but Tabata's approach to hair is generally toned down. Characters like Asta obviously have pretty crazy hair, but there's a lot of characters where their hair looks pretty normal, giving the characters a more down-to-earth feeling. Characters also tend to have slender bodies together with round faces. And a sort of calling card of Tabata, especially in early Black Clover, are the chins. Basically, the surefire way to know if Tabata drew something is to look at the chin and see if there's almost like a pointy bump. Tabata really likes to emphasize chins on characters, giving the faces a little more realism as opposed to just big circles with faces. Another calling card of Tabata in early Black Clover are the small eyes. You would think a character like Asta would have these big eyes to match his crazy energy, but Asta has relatively narrow eyes. Rather than big eyes, his circles are these kind of narrow, oval, but also rectangular shaped eyes. But that's Asta. For the most part, a lot of the characters have eyes like Yuno. Wide, but also narrow eyes and relatively small irises and pupils. But that isn't to say all the characters look the same. As a matter of fact, another thing that surprised me is how diverse the characters look. Characters in Black Clover have many different face shapes, and no two characters really have the same face. Each one has a particular look to it, which isn't something you can say for a lot of other series. One final note I'd like to make about early Black Clover is the paneling. Black Clover's paneling is very conventional, and it's especially true in early Black Clover. It does bend the rules here and there, but it isn't until much later that we get some unconventional paneling. On that note, let's move on to Stage 2. Stage 2 starts around chapter 73 and ends right around chapter 217. Like I said before, that's a lot of chapters. And this is because from this point on, Black Clover's art style really doesn't change. In this stage, there's only subtle changes, and most of what's true of early Black Clover is also true for Stage 2. Still a lot of detailed backgrounds and still a lot of conventional paneling. But on the topic of backgrounds, one thing fans might notice in this middle stage is that there are noticeably more blank backgrounds. Whereas before, Tabata favored scenes with as much detail as he could fit, this second stage includes more panels where there's the character and then there's just white space. It's not a dramatic amount, but it's enough that fans of the series will notice it. On a similar note, the line work also changes. Line work, of course, referring to the outlines of characters. In early Black Clover, line work is pretty normal of Shonen Jump in most comics. A lot of clearly defined details and outlines. But early Black Clover's line work is noticeably thinner. When you get into the later chapters, there's less smaller details and more thick outlines for the characters. It's a very subtle change, so much so that I was constantly like, I know these characters look different, but I have no idea why. Speaking of characters, let's talk about the changes to character designs. Again, it's hard to notice any changes, but when you pay really close attention, you can find them. First off are the faces. Whereas faces in early Black Clover have this wider, rounder shape to them, Tabata gives them a longer, more angled look in the second stage. So there's a little more emphasis on the jaws, and heads have more of an oval shape than before. Eyes and mouths are also bigger than before. You can look at just about any character and you'll notice that the eyes take up more of their face and there's more emphasis on mouth shapes rather than these tiny little mouths we see in early Black Clover. For example, take a look at Noelle in chapter 5. Fairly normal looking, right? Now compare that to Noelle in volume 6. Suddenly it looks much different. The eyes are clearly closer together, and Noelle in volume 6 definitely looks more stylized than Noelle in chapter 5. Again, on their own, it's hard to tell the difference, but there's clearly a trend towards the more stylized look. So the faces narrow a bit and the eyes and mouths get bigger, coming together to make faces in this second stage feel more balanced than in early Black Clover, whereas facial features seem relatively smaller and leave more empty space in the faces of characters. You could maybe argue that this dumbed the characters down in a way, made them more cartoony, I guess. But if you ask me, this was the perfect choice. Like we mentioned before, the simple characters contrast with the detailed backgrounds, so giving the characters this more stylized look only adds to that. Plus, I just think Black Clover characters look much cleaner later on than they do in early Black Clover. But on that note, let's move on to the final stage. Stage 3, or just the current stage, starts roughly at chapter 218 and continues up through the most recent chapters. There are even less changes in this stage than there were in the previous one. In fact, it kind of just continues the trends that start in stage 2. But there are some noticeable changes that distinguish this stage from the earlier ones. The first thing I noticed is once you get close to the joint struggle arc, you kind of lose the whole pointy chin thing. Granted, this is still a thing and you will see characters with tiny bumps that emphasize the chin, but they are tiny now and pop up much less often. What we see much more often are either rounded out chins or pointy or square chins. This is another very subtle change where you know something looks different, but you can't quite say why unless you really pay close attention. A much bigger change in this stage is the paneling. Starting in Joint Struggle, we get a lot more double spreads than ever before. This was something I never really noticed, but when you look at early Black Clover, you'll notice that Tabata almost never includes big double spreads. Instead, he will do big panels, but they usually only take up half a page or so. He really only does the bigger panels for scenes where he's introducing a new location or group of characters. But in the current stage, there's a lot more double spreads. Part of this is obviously due to the fact that there's a lot more fights in Joint Struggle in the Spade Kingdom arc. But in general, there's just a lot more of these kinds of big panels than ever before. On a similar note, we also get more blank backgrounds. There's enough of them that it's clearly distinguishable from the second stage. And I think when you combine this change and the change in paneling, it's easy to remember what's going on behind the scenes. Tabata is doing this big arc, but he's taking on a tremendous amount of pressure that would eventually result in the release schedule changes for the manga. So in retrospect, you can kind of see how Tabata's tendency to draw all these crazy details kind of shifts towards this trend of big panels, with more empty space to sort of fill up pages and not have to draw as much for each chapter. But this is before the new chapter this spring, so I'm curious to see how this might change in the future. Before I move on, I do have a couple more notes for this stage. First, one thing that sticks out to me are the buildings in the Land of the Sun. I said before that backgrounds in Black Clover have this fairy tale style to them, but then you get to the Land of the Sun and the buildings really stand out. The scenery is still stylized, but there's just something about the buildings. The castles in particular have this sharper, almost angular look to them. I wouldn't say they look more realistic, but they are noticeably different. Just a small detail I noticed that clearly gives the Land of the Sun a different vibe than the rest of the countries in Black Clover. Now, of course, what makes the later chapters of Black Clover stand out are the iconic sad faces. Granted, these aren't exclusive to the current chapters. We always saw this kind of character expression in earlier chapters, but for whatever reason, Tabata does a bunch of these really sad, very detailed faces in the later chapters, and they've just become synonymous with Black Clover's characters at this point. Now I'd like to revisit these three stages and discuss what I feel are the big changes in the art style. With early Black Clover, we pretty much set the tone for the entire series. Tabata basically knows what he's going for right away and never really deviates too far from his original style. So much so that if you take Asta from, say, chapter 350 and compare him to Asta from chapter 1, it's really hard to say that he looks all that much different. Sure, his character changes and his design changes, but his face looks almost identical. And this is true for a lot of the characters. Most of the changes are just their outfits or hair. Almost none of the characters really change all that much. And anything that makes them look different is usually due to the subtle changes in the art style. We start with more detailed backgrounds and characters, and gradually shift towards more stylized characters and more blank space and panels. Now, in addition to this general trend, I would like to end with a few closing notes. First of all, while some of the characters see more change than others, nobody sees more changes than Yami. Going back, it almost feels like there's like 7 different Yami designs. It's funny to say that because he's such a staple of the series, yet when you pay attention, his face and hair change pretty often, to the point where it almost feels like Tabata didn't know how he wanted him to look, or he always wanted to tune this character's design. Second, Tabata loves to draw funny reaction faces. They're not quite as crazy as some of the stuff in One Piece, but there's a lot of chibi faces that give Black Clover a distinct vibe. This is especially why I think Charmy is almost definitely Tabata's favorite character to draw. Finally, I think Tabata possesses a crazy amount of skill when it comes to character designs. Not only is there a wide array of unique characters with all kinds of different faces and outfits, but the designs only ever see subtle changes, and I think it's because Tabata puts so much deliberate detail into these characters in the first place. It all goes to show how talented Tabata is as an artist, and how consistent Black Clover's art style is overall. Much like the story, the art of Black Clover is something that will always get overlooked. It's beautifully detailed and is full of personality. It's for these reasons and more that, even though it doesn't change all that often, this art style will always be one of my personal favorites. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate Black Clover's art style? How would you say it's changed? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my video on My Hero Academia. In that video, I describe the artistic evolution of the My Hero manga. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.